All right, so I'm here with Pete Townsend to talk about Thunderclap Newman, the unique and wonderful group that Pete created and produced in his home studio. And it went on to have a number one hit in the summer of 1969 with Something in the Air. Um, it's a fascinating story. And before we get into the group itself, I just wanted to see if we could start at the beginning. Um, so of the three individuals who went on to become Thunderclap Newman, um, Andy was the first one you came across back at art school in 1963. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and your first impressions of Andy.
Yeah, well, it's covered really beautifully in the book, um, and there's a lot in the book that I didn't know uh, because the Andy himself got to contribute, and so there was a lot I didn't know about his story. But I think what's interesting is for me was the fact that he came to do a lecture at Ealing Art College. We had lunchtime lectures with some really interesting people. The um, the musician um, who worked with Robert Margouleff, who worked with and Malcolm Cecil, who worked with Stevie Wonder, came. Malcolm Cecil was in a jazz band at the time, the Johnny Scott Quintet. A playwright called David Mercer, who was a left-wing activist playwright. His collection of plays was called The Generation. So I don't know whether that stuck in my mind.
Hmm.
Uh, a guy called Mike English did a lecture playing Chuck Berry songs, which to a lot of people, that was the first time they'd heard them.
Hmm.
But then one day, somebody cancelled, and Dick Seaman, who was organising the lectures, asked his friend, Andy Newman, whether he would come in and do an event. And Andy didn't really say anything. He just sat at the piano with his great side to side on. They had an upright piano so that he could rest his long, handmade, homemade kazoo on the music stand on the upright piano. And it was Dick who explained that Andy had a method, a special method. He explained that it had developed out of a passion for one very, very brief and rare keyboard performance by the jazz trumpeter Bix Beiderbecke,
Hmm.
I think, which was called In a Mist.
Hmm.
I think that was the piece. And if you listen to it, if you can get online and listen to that piece by Bix Beiderbecke, you'll hear how he um, impressed Andy. Andy's style was not traditional jazz, it was something beyond that. It was very harmonically rich and strange and eccentric, but definitely was inspired by Bix. Anyway, Dick said Andy can use his technique, his method, he called it, on
Hmm.
anything, and welcomed um, recommendations. And one of them, I think, was a Beatles song. I can't remember which one, but it was the one that was current at the time. Um, and he did a great version of it on the piano. And then he played a few of his own compositions. And that was where it got really interesting. Because his style was very much chordal, um, with the melody just provided by the kazoo. He sang into the kazoo, and that was really where the melodies grew. And it was quite clear he had a really wonderful sense of melody. But the lecture ended, and I was deeply, deeply impressed and inspired. And my friend Barney, who was in the same course as I was, um, and I had a flat together, I think at the time, or we were hanging out together anyway. And we saw him walking down the street one day, just walking along, slowly humming. And I got really excited. I sort of treated him like he was a superstar. And we didn't approach him. I just kept saying, fuck, it's Thunderclap Newman, it's Thunderclap Newman. And subsequently, knowing how crazy about his work I was, Dick Seaman gave me um, an acetate of um, some of the songs that Andy had recorded, which he wasn't very proud of, but there's beautiful record. I've still got it. I put it up online when I had a website.
Mhm.
And that's how it started. I never really ever properly got to know him. That's why when I read the book, I was so much, so much came to bear about his childhood and that he was a very eccentric man. There's no question.
Mhm. Yeah. And and so then so that was the first piece that would wind up being obviously a key to Thunderclap Newman. Then a couple of years later, the Who were performing in Scotland, and this group called the Jagars opened for the Who, and their guitarist was 11, and was a tiny 11-year-old for an 11-year-old. I was wondering if and I think that's the first time you came across Jimmy. So I was wondering if you could talk about
Yeah, I don't remember that much about that. When we played in Scotland, it was always a bit strange. They particularly this was over in Greenock, I think, which was a shipbuilding area of Scotland, which is now in decline. Apart, they've got a few war contracts, naval contracts, but it was a bustling industry that was in decline, the beginning of decline. And um, the gigs that went on there were often very poorly attended. And we were a hit band, but I don't remember it being very full up.
that.
So what actually happened was the promoter would try to put off the main act going on for as long as possible until the people came out of the pub and could see the main attraction. And so Jimmy's band played for about an hour and a half, lots and lots and lots of stuff. And they were a good band. His brother was in the band, I think, and a couple of other people. It was not a bad band, but he was quite extraordinary for somebody so young. You know, um, uh, Jimi Hendrix was around, very much so at the time. So, and Eric Clapton, and and myself, but Jeff Beck too. All of those um, uh, famous blues guitar players were around, and Jimmy's technique really kind of leapt out at me. It was very, very clean, very, very thought through. When he was playing solos, he was obviously making them up, but he was immensely creative. But he'd obviously practiced a lot of scales. What he wanted to play fell under his fingers very, very easily. And and I can't remember what happened. I may have offered to help the band in some way. I can't remember, but I remember having my photograph taken. And then I think there was a little story in the local Scottish newspaper, as I remember it. But again, you probably know more than I do about that. But uh, yeah, that's how I met him. And then subsequently, I kept in contact.
Mhm.
I think I lent him some equipment. It was a bit hard because we were a long way away. They lived in Glasgow.
Right, right. So then the third piece comes along the following spring when Speedy Keen returns from performing with a group in Italy, right at the same time that Chris Thomas is looking for a drummer for his group, the Cat. And yeah, Chris told me that he contacted you and you offered up a new song that you'd written called "Run, Run, Run."
Yeah,
Went into the studio with the Cat and recorded it. And as far as I know, it's never been released. But that I believe was your first meeting with Speedy. So if you could just
yeah.
talk.
It was the meeting with Speedy with when I was producing the Cat, one of my songs. Um, we played it to a record company chief, an A&R guy who just said, "Oh, it's a bit repetitive," and subsequently the Who did record it. But at that time, I was trying to build up production. I'd enjoyed producing music, and I wanted to produce music, and uh, to be honest, the idea that Chris Thomas was in the band kind of eluded me for quite a long time. sorry, that Speedy was in Chris Thomas's band. I remembered Chris because he went on to produce me, and we occasionally talked about it. But I forgot that Speedy was in that band, and that's obviously how I met him.
Right. And what do you remember about? I don't know. Obviously, it's a long time ago. But what do you remember about Speedy, or what was it that? Because it seemed like you became good friends quite quickly. Hit it off quite quickly.
Yeah, I don't really quite know why we hit it off so quickly. He was on the verge of creating another band. He'd been in a band with that guy, Pat Lyons, who I think Chris Thomas knew quite well as well, who I saw recently in America. He was in good shape and still working, but so he's still around. But he Pat Lyons was a face figure in Ealing Common, where the Ealing Club was. And there was another place opposite the Ealing Club, a pub, I think it may be called the King's Head, where bands performed. And Pat Lyons' band was quite famous locally. They
Mm.
were a cool band. He was a extraordinary looking guy. I suppose I wouldn't have assessed it at the time, but I suppose an attractive man. And I think Speedy was playing drums with him
Mm.
and doing a couple of shows. So I went to see them, and I wasn't looking for a drummer, but um, we spoke about songwriting. And what was clear was that Speedy didn't have many completed ideas, but he had dozens of amazing song titles. Um, I've got a list of them somewhere. I mean, they're quite extraordinary. Um, the the one that we worked on together subsequently for a while before he came to work for me as a driver and an ADC, an aide de camp, in
Ah,
a
okay.
military expression, um, was an opera idea, a rock opera idea called Summer City. And I wrote the opening song, and he came up with titles for a bunch of other songs. I had my studio then in Soho,
Mm.
and I had a little drum kit there, a crappy drum kit, and we made a few demos together, some of which have leaked out. They're really dreadful, but we
Mm.
had a lot of fun. I think I was still smoking marijuana, not a huge amount, but I wasn't drinking very much. But we would get stoned, make some demos, chat, listen to records, hang out together. And I found him funny. But also he was very interesting. He was another eccentric. I think the thing about these three guys was I was on the lookout for eccentrics. I
Mm.
had this idea to make a record um, label called Talkus, Talkus. And it was inspired by meeting Tiny Tim in New York. Um, and I wanted Tiny Tim to be on this record label. I wanted Thunderclap Newman to be on the record. I wanted Little Jimmy to be on the record, and Speedy, but also Arthur Brown, who I discovered a rave, a psychedelic rave, and started to kind of try to juggle recording sessions and writing sessions with all of these people. Um, uh, and Then Tommy came along, and it was a huge hit, and we got really, really, really busy. I was working on Tommy throughout this time. And
Mm.
one of the things about working on Tommy was that the demos that I did for Tommy were not the best demos that I'd ever done, but they were cohesive. And I had a home studio in my house in Twickenham where I'd moved to from Soho, and it was a really good studio. And so I felt I could bring people in from outside and work with them and develop that idea. And
Mm.
what actually happened was that I said to Kit Lambert, Talkus was going to be a part of Track Records. It was going to be a label inside Track Records. And Kit said, Pete, you're not going to be able to do this. I'll take over Arthur Brown because he knew he had a number one hit record, I think. I'll take over Arthur Brown, and you take Tiny Tim is a no-no. he's just too eccentric. And anyway, he's based in New York. Take the three that are left and form a band with them. So that's what I did. I took Kit's advice and we
Right.
managed to make a record in my home studio.
Yeah, and that's one of the many things that I love about this story is, outside of the music and the fascinating characters involved, is it sheds a light on perhaps a lesser known side of you, not on stage windmilling and smashing guitars, but in the studio, in the creative environment, and specifically in this case in a home studio. Um, and I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about that side of you, and what it means to you, that being in that environment.
Well, again, Kit Lambert, who took over The Who from Pete Meaden, the famous mod face who managed The Who and called them the High Numbers for a short period of time. Kit Lambert and his partner Chris Stamp came over and took over The Who in 1964. And the first thing that Kit did, I had a couple of domestic tape machines, was he could see that I was songwriting, and I'd written Can't Explain. I'd made a recording of it on a machine. That demo sadly got lost. I sent it to Shell Talma and it's got lost.
Mm.
And I did another song for The Who called Anywhere, Anyhow, Anywhere, which again I did a scratch tape of, which again got lost. I sent it to Roger to share in, and he lost it, or somebody lost it. So Kit suggested to me that I got professional tape machines. So I got two tape machines made by a company called Vortexian, based on the Ferrograph machine, which was a fixed film studio machine for recording on sound stages. For mobile work, film companies tended to use a machine called a Nagra, which I got a copy of. I got a version of a bit later. I think I maybe even had one. But when I was still living with not living with my parents, but above my parents, Barney, my friend, and I had a flat, and I moved back to my parents briefly. And we shared this huge flat together. I had a studio there with these two machines. And it was that machine that I wrote the first few track to track demos. What had actually happened a few years before, or a year before, is so much happened in a short space of time, I compress it all, was that the band that I was in with John Entwistle, which was a school band called the Confederates, I think, or it may have been called something else. There was a guy called Pete Wilson who played lead guitar, and his father knew this man called Barry Gray, who was a composer for kids TV things, which with puppets called the Thunderbirds.
Mhm.
And he arranged for us to go and make a demo. And when I got there, he turned his little middle class house into a recording studio. What
Mm.
should have been the dining room was the studio, the stage. What should have been the sitting room was the studio. And he had EMI tape machines, and he had a spring reverb box, and he had a compressor. So he made this little, and I'd written my first song by that time. This is before Can't Explain, called It Was You. We made a demo of it. And I remember looking at what he was doing and thinking, this is just equipment. The idea that you could actually have a studio in your home, you didn't have to go to Abbey Road, you didn't have to go to IBC, you didn't have to go to any of the posh studios, Delane Lee or whatever. You could just have equipment at home. You just had to buy it. Sorry, you just had to buy it and learn how to operate it. So Kit helped me get these early tape machines. So by the time I was living under his aegis, he moved me into London to live in Belgravia, and I had a studio in Cheshire Place, which is where I did the demos for Magic Bus and Kids Are All Right and My Generation. I had two tape machines. I still didn't have any echo, but I had two tape machines. I didn't have compressors, but I had two tape machines and a Reslo microphone. It was really high quality stuff. And I just loved it. I just loved doing that stuff. I just loved working at home. So when I finally got my studio in Soho, and then subsequently in Victoria, and then finally when my wife and I got married, we moved to a little house in Twickenham where there was this tiny bathroom, and I converted that into a control room and an even smaller room in which I put an organ and a drum kit. You can see photos online of me sitting at my Lowry organ with a VCS3.
Mhm.
You know, I still love it. You know, I'm sitting in a studio now. I live out in the countryside. I've got my own studios. I've got maybe 10 studios of various sorts. It's my hobby, my passion, and my enthusiasm. And really, what I wanted back then was I wanted to prove that I could make proper records in that environment. And the record that I made with Thunderclap was a really fine record. Some of the tracks on Hollywood Dream, their first album, were
Mhm.
recorded on stereo tape machines, bouncing from stereo to stereo using Dolby noise reduction, which was new at the time. And I was the first person in the UK to use it. In fact, Abbey Road bought one box. I bought five.
Oh, well.
And um, so I had one Dolby on each machine, so you could bounce backwards and forwards many, many times before you got any hiss or before you got any distortion. But what was interesting about the sessions with Thunderclap was that we were able to record a band, so onto one track of a stereo machine, add another couple of musicians, and then bounce that, adding some more musicians. So after a couple of passes of tape, you'd end up with the equivalent of maybe 16 tracks of music.
Mhm.
And I would often play the bass on the tracks while I was mixing and while I was fiddling with the sound. It
Mhm.
was just huge fun. I just loved it. And we made the record in about 2 weeks.
Yeah, amazing. And Something in the Air was one of the first things, if not the first, that you actually worked on. And from everything I can tell, the first time the three individuals actually met was in your home studio there. So
I think that's right. I think they all met when I invited them round just to see the studio, and Jimmy had to come down from Glasgow, and he came with his brother Jack, I think, and I think Jimmy may have stayed a couple of times because he didn't have a hotel or anything, so we looked after him at home. But I think the first demo that I did with Speedy was a song called Club of Lights, which he sold to Robert Stigwood,
mhm.
and a guy that Stigwood was managing at the time recorded it. It wasn't a hit. It was a good song, but uh, yeah. What was interesting about um, Something in the Air was that was the first song that I heard from Speedy that made sense structurally. He had a normal guitar and he uh, tuned it to a G chord, an E chord, sorry. So he would just play the the E shape, and that's what would give it that characteristic uplift every time he played the change. And had this song, you know, and I to be honest, I didn't jack into what the theme of it was. I just loved the melody and loved Speedy's thin, reedy voice and the beautiful melody. I just loved it. But when we finished the record and it was out, I realized that the song was really about an invitation to a violent revolution.
Yeah,
You know, I missed out the line, get out the guns and ammo, you know.
right.
And there was a fair bit of that around at that time. You know, by the time The Who got to recording um, the Who's next album, the Lifehouse Project, I was under a lot of pressure from the activists of the day, you know, who wanted the Who to be more like MC5 and be politically active and engaged in activist revolutionary behavior and anti-political establishment work, and I resisted it, and that's where the song "Won't Get Fooled Again" came from, and some of the ideas from Lifehouse came from that too. But I think the Speedy was ahead of the curve, and I think possibly ahead of the curve because of his relationship with Pat Lyons, with the Ealing scene. There's a lot that was going on with the Ealing scene right under my nose when I was at art school that I missed. You know, I never got to see the Stones at the Ealing Club, although I saw them in the street. I never got to see Alexis Corner. I never got to see Cyril Davis. You know, these were the guys who started the revolution of R&B in the UK. The only other figure that had similar influence was, funny enough, was a guy called Lonnie Donegan, who was a banjo and guitar player with Humphrey Lyttelton and another jazz guy whose name I forget. And these two figures actually introduced the pop musician fans who were listening to people like Leadbelly and so on, and maybe Chuck Berry, introduced them to uh, the idea that there was a new way to make R&B, which was the European way, if you like, the British way. And by the time I jacked into the fact that I shouldn't have been studying at art school and going to bed at night, uh, the Who were in their early days and were doing gigs all the time. I never had time, but Speedy was there for all of that. I think it's fair to say he probably saw the Stones. He probably saw Cyril Davis and Alexis Corner, their early band. And remember that band, Cyril Davis and Alexis Corner, that was the first band that Brian Jones and Mick Jagger performed together on a stage before Mick had even met Keith Richards. You know, so I think I've got that right. I'm not sure, but certainly they did. In the early days, they had a saxophone player for some of their sessions. And so the Ealing scene was really vibrant. It was really, it had a special atmosphere about it. Speedy was definitely a part of that.
Yeah.
And it's possible too that Thunderclap was a part of that, in a slightly different way. I was kind of passing through in a sense, you know,
Yeah.
and also my influences from art college and all the people at art college were overwhelming me. So what was interesting is I was working with Thunderclap Newman as a band, working on Speedy's compositions, and of course Thunderclap and Jimmy both wrote really interesting songs. One of the things that was happening for me was that I was operating purely technically and as a creative producer, as an organizational producer. I mean, when it came to working with Thunderclap, I introduced two key changes, an orchestral composition, you know, a whole load of technical stuff. But the basic song was there before I started fiddling with it.
Yeah, and I was wondering if, because you told me that this session is, or your work with Thunderclap Newman is your favorite recording session ever, more than any Who session or anything. And I was wondering why. And I thought to myself, perhaps one reason is it was not your material, so maybe minimal pressure or minimal expectations, and especially in the context of you were in the middle of writing and recording Tommy, which I assume there were huge pressure and huge expectations from that. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
The session with Thunderclap Newman, the band, was my favorite session that I think I've ever done. I think basically because the system, the method that I'd worked out for making demos, funnily enough, there's a side story to this, which is that the system that I had, which was two Revox G36 tape machines, stereo tape machines, which this guy called Peppy Rush had arranged for me with a sync button, which meant that you could record on track one and then playing back track one, you could record on track two, and they would stay in line. If you do that on a normal stereo machine, the track, one of the tracks is late when you come to play it back. Um, so I had that system. But when I was around the time that I started to work with Thunderclap, I had these Dolby units. Um, that's a complicated story in itself. I had a company which was selling home studios to other artists, and our office was next door to Ray Dolby's place in Clapham. And I knew him because we had boats on the River Thames, which were the same make, quite a modest little speedboat. So we used to see each other quite a lot. And he told me about his units, and I bought them. And it just revolutionized the quality of my demos. Where you see those first demos as records is on the Mayha Barber albums. That was
Okay.
when I first started bouncing backwards and forwards. And the fact that I could just, and in that case, I was working on my own. I might put down a guitar and a vocal, then another bass, and then some drums, and then something else and something else. So after two or three copies backwards and forwards, I might only have maybe six musical tracks, as it were. But working with this system with the band, I was
Mhm.
playing bass, Speedy was on drums, Jimmy was in what was a wardrobe playing guitar, and Andy was playing the piano, which was in the room with the tape machines. And so we were able to put four musicians down, either in stereo or in mono, on one track.
Mm.
So all we had to do was use the remaining track to add another bunch of stuff, which might just be maybe Andy playing a clarinet, Jimmy playing an electric guitar, maybe then bounce that down to stereo and then add some more stuff. We might, after two or three generations, we would have a lot of performances. And the Dolby made sure that it was really, really clean. And sadly, that meant that the masters that went to be turned into vinyl went to track to be cut, and I've never seen them again.
Oh, I
I've
see.
not been able to access them. I've
Yeah.
got a rough copy of them, but I don't have the original recordings. They were really, really beautifully sonic, but they exist on the vinyl if you can get a hold of the vinyl.
Right. Right.
But I loved it. I loved the fact that I had this fantastic system, and it was really small. I mean, you've seen photos of my control rooms from that period, and it's like a submarine. You know, I could sit playing the bass on a song called Accidents. I was playing the bass and also queuing up sound effects at the
Mhm.
same time. We only did two passes. You know,
Wow.
we got it right really quickly. You know, and right in the middle of Accidents, there's really quite a complex diversion from Andy, where not only does he have to play his own little solo, he has to slow the tempo down to fit his system and then speed it back up again to get back into the song. And he
Yeah.
was so good at it. He was so good at it. It was really fun. And Jimmy, by that time, was just a superb soloist. He was really good um, acoustic player. I never played any acoustic guitar on any of that album. Jimmy did it all. He used my J200, which is now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Oh, well.
He and I think he used to. I think he had his own electric guitar, but he sometimes used to use mine. But I could get a really good guitar sound in that studio. Obviously, is what I do. So um, it was, I had a few tricks, a few little tricks. I used to put the bass drum in the fireplace, you know, where you would have a fire with a chimney, and I'd put the microphone for the bass drum halfway up the chimney.
All right.
So on one of the songs, I think it's a song called I Don't Know,
Mhm.
the bass drum is just huge. It's just
Yeah.
massive, massive. I wish I
Amazing.
had the tapes because I would sample it. You know, it's such a great
Yeah.
sound.
Yeah. Were there, and I was just thinking when you were talking about Jimmy, of course, when he first, um, when those early sessions, he was 15, and then he turned 16 the summer of 69. So the guitarist on the album, if he's not the 16-year-old, is a 15-year-old. which
Yeah.
is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Um, I was just thinking, were there lessons that you learned during the Thunderclap sessions that you took away and used during perhaps your solo career or with The Who or recording demos going forward?
No, my techniques were pretty much established by the time, which is my point is that through my demos, I'd established that technique and I went on to make a record in that room with The Who. I did an EP with The Who where Keith Moon brought in a bloody great big drum kit. And I remember all the neighbors, um, rather than complaining, they were all standing in the street outside to listen.
Oh,
um, because John's bass amp was down in the basement of the house. So if you stood outside the house, you could hear The Who. Um, but yeah, my techniques were evolving and still are today. You know, I'm very, very technical minded, but um, I think the one thing that maybe I learned came from working with song accidents from the album and Something in the Air, which was that I arranged them. I did the arrangements. I
mhm.
wrote them out. I didn't use notation because I couldn't at the time. I can now, but I couldn't then. I blocked it. I turned it into blocks. I rehearsed the band so that they knew what to do. I played along on bass. I I had, in other words, I had a vision of what the finished thing would sound like. And up to that point, I tended to just throw paint at the wall, as it were.
Mhm.
I'd just done it for fun. And um, if something came out of it, like a song like My Generation, so be it. But generally, that's not the way I approached it. You know, My Generation had several incarnations. And it got more and more aggressive but it started off as a kind of a talking blues. It was a
Mhm.
very kind of very simple track. But so I was working in my home studio for fun. I loved doing it, and it still is like a hobby. A studio for me is like a train set.
Right, right. And I was thinking another piece of it too is seems like you get some kind of satisfaction or fulfillment out of the mentoring piece of it too. I was just listening to a podcast you did recently with the Wild Things. So that work kind of continues.
It does, and it doesn't stop there. I've done several things. I'm working with somebody at the moment who's a street performer. Um, I'm working with a couple of people. I really, yeah, I don't know whether mentoring is quite the right word. I think mentoring is conversation. It's like, and in today's world, it always has been tough working with unknown musicians. You know, because you could say to them, "Yes, I'll help you make a record," but when it's done, what new musicians always want is they want me then to make that record into a hit for them,
Mm,
and I can't do that. I
right.
can't. I can't even offer the managerial support. I can't even offer the contacts that they need.
Yeah.
The 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 interesting thing about the Bookshop band that I've just made a record with that I'm very proud of is that they're very, very active in managing their own career. Reg Muros, who's just about to release Fire and Dust, the Woody Guthrie collection of songs, which I produced, has a manager who's helping him to sort of build a career. Um, but with the Wild Things, they're really full on with social media. We had a video recently where I talked about the fact that they should just very, very simply they should push Sid more. You know, she's blonde, she's sexy, she's pretty. Push her, you know.
All
The rest of them are just musicians. You know, there's plenty of them around. And I noticed that they've started to do it, but that's just the kind of advice that you would give to your friends, you
Yeah.
know. So actually in the process of working with uh, creative people, one of the things that's really important is getting them to put stuff down, just to put stuff down. You know, you see on Instagram painters, whether they're amateur or professional, just saying, just start, you know, don't put it off. And I think that's true. You know, Rick Rubin is making a living out of it now, just saying to people, just start making music. Well, with music, you have to record it. You either have to write it down in notation or you have to record it in some way. And, you know, recording for a lot of musicians is beyond their capability. I know so many musicians that are brilliant, brilliant guitarists and keyboard players. And when you show them a laptop or a, you know, a small Porter Studio type system, they freak out. They can't do the left side of the brain over to the right side of the brain. They can only work on the right side of the brain. So a lot of new music is incredibly left side of the brain, right side of the brain. You know, the fact that people that are working on laptops with virtual instruments and digital audio audio workstations at home, this legend that people are making hit records at home, maybe some of them are, but not many of them. Billie Eilish is a good example, I think. But
Mm-hmm.
I expect she's now working in studios because it's a nicer place to work, apart from anything else. You know, you get tea, you get buns, you get sushi. Um, whereas at home you just get canned soup or whatever's in the fridge. Um, I think the issue really was that with Thunderclap Newman, I don't think any of them could have done what I did for them. I don't think any other producer could have done what I did for them.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it is something that I love to do. So I'm kind of, I think because it was so fabulous for me, such a joy, and it gave me my only number one record.
Right.
It's
Right.
the only one I've ever had. So
Amazing.
so when I'm working with other musicians, I always feel, well, Pete, you know, you may end up sounding a bit grandiose or a bit like a know-all, but share what you know. You know, it's free.
Yeah. You know, one of the interesting or fascinating pieces of this story too is back and forth. These little sessions were the Hollywood Dream sessions were squeezed in between Who activity. You know, like a couple of days after Woodstock, you're back in your little studio in your house with Speedy and Jimmy and Andy, or the day after the two concerts with Chuck Berry at the Royal Albert Hall, the Pop Proms. Like the morning after, you were back in the studio with Thunderclap Newman, or you know, within a couple of days of Live at Leeds of the Leeds concert. Just was it difficult to kind of switch back and forth between Who and back in your studio with
I
Thunderclap?
don't know. I don't want to kind of um, elect myself as as somebody that has ADHD or anything, but I definitely like to. My son Joseph puts it very politely. He describes the way I operate as dynamic. In other words, I pick things up and I put them down, and I pick things up and I put them down, which means that I'm quite slow to finish things. So I started to talk about Tommy 18 months before it came out.
Yeah, yeah,
And I did the same with Quadrophenia. I did the same with Lifehouse. I do the same with everything. I'm very loath now to talk about projects that I'm working on now because one of them, one significant one, The Age of Anxiety, I started 17 years ago. So I think, but what's my point? My point is that at that time, it felt very natural. I was also, remember, what's interesting about this is that my wife and my daughter Emma, who was a baby and a pusher, came with me to Woodstock. When we came home, yes, I was working with Thunderclap Newman, but in the house. You know, we were home. It was a thing we did at home. My
yeah.
wife Karen was very, very understanding of my need to work at home. She never complained. My daughter Emma, in an interview that she did when she issued a book many years ago, said that when she was a little girl, she used to like to hear me work in my studio because she knew that I was there. in the house. It helped her to sleep. And so there were positives and negatives, but certainly I would have been trying to squeeze in a lot of things at the time. I think one thing that's really important to talk about here is that we never made any money.
Right.
So there was always this sense that if it's not about making money, if it's, Thunderclap Newman with Something in the Air got a #1 record. It was given to Track Records. They never paid me a producer royalty. They never paid for my studio costs. They never paid me anything. They just took all of the money. I happened to publish the song for Speedy. So I was paying Speedy his publishing money from my company, Fabulous, but Track never paid anybody anything. I think his daughter recently had to take what's left of Track to court to try to update. They were a really, really criminal pair, Chris Stamp and Kit Lambert, but it was incredibly exciting. So there was so much going on. Tommy was a quick hit again on Track. So for years, not until Bill Curbishley took over our career after we'd finished making Quadrophenia, did the Who ever make any money at all. We made bits and bobs because we were touring a lot, so we were making road money. But Tommy was selling in shitloads, but we still never got any money. So in a sense, it's not that I was sitting there thinking, I don't have any money. I was thinking, I don't give a fuck about the money. What I give a fuck about is the fact that I'm having fun, doing what I want to, being creative, helping other people to be creative, and delivering Thunderclap Newman with a hit. It was just joyous. And remember that Tommy subsequently was hugely successful. We I'm a bit concerned about the dates that you've got there because Woodstock we played bits of Tommy at Woodstock. So, but it's interesting that that Tommy was a hit, and I think then Something in the Air became a hit, and so it felt to me that I was on a creative role.
Yeah, because Tommy, the album, the UK release of the Tommy album and the UK release of Something in the Air on Track were the same day in May of '69.
Oh wow!
So, which meant you were immediately gone from with the Who promoting this new work, and the three guys are left to their own devices, and
they made a mess of it. I mean, the first thing that happened was that Speedy decided not to play the drums.
Right.
It was nuts. It was nuts.
Yeah.
They should have hired a singer. He was such a great drummer. And he brought in really good drummers, but of course, basically they were a trio and they should have remained as close to a trio as possible. And possibly if they had toured, if I'd have been around, I might have toured with them, done a few shows with them to try to form the band, and I would have played bass possibly. But sadly, I wasn't around. As you say, I was gone. And I was hearing the news about them and hearing terrible stories about chaos that was going on, about them hiring this cottage in the country to do their rehearsals. I mean, that's a huge mistake for any band. The only band that I ever heard that got away with that was Traffic. This little cottage in Berkshire, big supply of marijuana and made a fantastic album. But for most people, it never worked.
Yeah, for Thunderclap Newman, when the song was #1, they got the peak of their media attention that they received from Melody Maker and the NME. They all came down to this old corn mill where Thunderclap Newman were supposedly rehearsing, but all the accounts, the feature articles about them, there's not much about rehearsing going on there. It's everything else, going to the pub and playing in the river and riding horses and things like that.
I think they needed some discipline. I think what was interesting about having worked with two producers, one was Shel Talmay, who wasn't so much disciplined, he was just really, really fast. and he didn't really care much about how the band felt about the music. But working with Kit as producer, it was that it was always fun,
Mm.
and he would allow a lot of time for a recording session, but we would get the job done. And um, and we had really good production managers on the road with us. We were looked after. We had cash to spend just to stay alive. And we didn't have money to buy cars or houses, but we had cash to spend. And
Mm.
um, so that bit of the machinery didn't seem to work for the Thunderclap Newman band, and it's a shame because, I think what it's a shame is that that Andy was quite a performer. He could have done some really extraordinary work. I think there are some recordings of that I heard of them performing in Sweden, and it's not bad.
Yeah.
It's not bad.
Yeah.
You've
Um,
heard you've heard that.
yeah, in the Netherlands, there's some of
Yeah.
them in '71 in the Netherlands. So there were a few different attempts for them to get the act together on the road, and there were a couple of times where there were reports that they were set to open for the Who on some tour in a few months, which never came to fruition. Um, and then they were pulled off the road in August of '69. The focus was back to when you were available to recording the album. And then in at the beginning of '71 or first half of '71, it seems like they just kind of disintegrated. There wasn't a big announcement that they'd broken up, but they just kind of went their separate directions. And of course, that's when you were working on Lifehouse,
Yeah.
and Thunderclap Newman performed at least one of the workshops at the Young Vic. And I was just wondering if you could talk about the connection between Andy and the Lifehouse story.
It's very, very thin, but I think what actually happened was that when I was writing my basic, very, very naive film script, um, Lifehouse is set in a recording studio or on a studio stage. It's set in a workshop. The Lifehouse itself is a workshop. It is a place that has been secretly established to feed music and information and experience to people out on a national grid, which is actually run by the government to provide. In other words, it jacks in to a legitimate broadcasting service. It jacks in with a much healthier and much more musical and much more creative content. And that was produced in the Lifehouse. And technologically, there were some mountains for me to climb. One was how to convert the music that we had in the studio into something that reflected the people that were involved in the workshopping and which involved synthesizers and possibly computers, which I was trying to build or wait for at the time. And Andy was really technically brilliant, brilliant guy. He was involved in the post office. He could build radios. So I had him in my mind when I was writing the story and created the leading figure was a guy called Bobby, after Tommy Bobby, and
Right.
in my head was Andy, a big rolling guy who was coming up with all these ideas that were going to kind of help. Not to, he wasn't the creative engine, he was the technical engine. He was the technical in the story. Bobby was the technocrat, the guy who made the machinery.
Mm-hmm.
And and I remember when I delivered the script, Chris Stamp in particular subsequently did a radio, contributed to a radio documentary, and he said, we couldn't work it out. This script of Bobby, it was about a fucking roadie. What's wrong with being a fucking roadie is what I think. You um, I suppose in a sense, the the it felt for me that I wanted him there. I wanted him to be a part of it. But remember that the workshops were very, very different to the studio production process. That was something I was doing on my own. Um, Andy did come once or twice. I'm not quite sure what he did, but for most of the workshops at the Young Vic in London, we had 30 people, 20 people at the most, because they never advertised it. They were afraid of advertising it in case it turned into, The Who was selling out festivals. So, they were worried that it would get out of control. So it just really never took off. But Andy
Yeah.
was involved. And yeah, I felt that Andy was a symbolic figure to me. He was, I spoke about how Kit Lambert was important to me, introducing me to film stage recording machines. Uh, but Andy was the same. Andy was doing machine to machine, uh, like Phil Spector, but at home. He was doing the same thing and helped me with a few ideas that I'd had at the time. We were both doing it at the same time, but he was inspiring, what he was doing and affirming what I was trying to do. And subsequently, a guy called Pepe Rush, who I met when I had my studio in Soho, who raised my equipment up to a much higher standard, technically speaking, and made me a couple of compressors, my first compressors that I used to mix the Live at Leeds album, which I mixed at home in the same studio. But towards the end of the Thunderclap session, I got my first proper 8-track recording machine. It was the same model as we had an Olympic, where we'd occasionally recorded, and with Dolby's on every track. And one of the first tests of it was a couple of the tracks on the album. I think, what's that song? Wild something, Wild Country.
Wild Country.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was done on 8-track. And I think a song by Jimmy, one of Jimmy's songs, was recorded on 8-track, but most of it was done on stereo machines, reel to reel.
Yeah.
But
And I think
I got
Andy was sorry. I think Andy mentioned that 8-track was the first in the country, if not one of the first. Another cutting edge piece of equipment that arrived during the sessions.
I think it was certainly the Dolby. I was the first person to use Dolbys. And the interesting thing about that is it meant that you didn't really have to go to 16-track, which a lot of people were waiting for, because you could bounce down, within the tracks, within the machines without getting too much hiss. Or Dolby didn't just deal with hiss, it also dealt with harmonic distortion. It suppressed harmonic distortion down in harmonic distortion tends to on tape tends to come from the tape itself. It's not part of the music, so it cleaned it up tremendously. The current Dolby system, spectral recording, goes even further. It's a superb system, but that came along just at the time when tape was fading away. And we were moving to work on digital. But I think the interesting thing was that that machine arrived, and like I said, I was making tapes for the Lifehouse for the Who's Next album that Glyn Johns was producing, and my machine at home was exactly the same as the machine at Olympic.
Right. So the group breaks up. Andy and Speedy and Jimmy went their separate ways. That's one of the reasons in the book that I tried to tell the story with the three combined before and after, but they were so separate that I just created separate chapters for each one of them, and pre Thunderclap and post Thunderclap. And Jimmy famously went on. He joined several bands. He was only 18 when Thunderclap broke up, and he went on to join John Mayall right away, which speaks to how incredibly gifted he was as a guitarist. But he joined Stone the Crows, and he ended up famously joining Wings. And of course, Andy and Speedy did their own solo efforts. And Speedy, a little bit later on in the 70s, went on to produce Motorhead, which took me by surprise. And Andy worked with, Roger Spear and with some comedy acts and things like that. And I was just wondering, was there anything, because it seems like you had lost touch with the three of them for the most part post Thunderclap. I was wondering if there was anything in the book that took you by surprise or
Everything took me by surprise. And I loved the book. I love it. I think I love the early part. I love the way that the story unfolds. But you do stick to, as the author, you do stick to the story. You stay faithful to the characters and follow them. And of course, Jimmy's story is tragic.
right.
He became a really serious alcoholic. And when the Tommy movie was on in LA, he came to hang out with me, and Ronnie Wood and I, and both of us were hard drinkers and drug users. Um, Certainly not me drugs at the time, but certainly hard drinking. We had to carry him home. He was helpless after the premiere. So no, no, no. It was after the Oscars, the Oscar ceremony. The
Okay.
He, the book stays with them until, and but the interesting thing for me, for example, as I said earlier, a thing about their childhoods, the fact that you've looked at them as human beings, and it's so interesting that this is true of so many people that have had one-off hit records. They have their lives, they have their one hit record, they're famous for a bit, and then they disappear. This boy,
Mm-hmm.
Liam Payne from One Direction, that died the other day,
Yeah.
the tragedy of it is I remember where I lived in Richmond in London, opposite there was a hotel where One Direction used to stay when they were in London, and there were thousands of girls outside,
Yeah.
young girls, from the age of 14 up to 20, ready to throw themselves at the boys, or creating storms of enthusiasm at the tree.
Yeah.
And then suddenly nothing, suddenly quietness, suddenly being alone on your own, mental difficulties, trouble
Mm.
with money. I think um, obviously Andy didn't seem to suffer from that. I mean, Andy kept his life pretty simple, I think.
Yeah.
Uh, but I know that Speedy had a relationship with a woman called Anya, who was Kit Lambert's secretary for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I know they were very, very fond of each other. I gave him my Lincoln Continental car, and he rode around with a bit until it broke down and he couldn't afford to fix it. But um, he seemed okay for a while. We saw each other. We used to go out on my boat on the River Thames.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, And he hadn't changed. He was really good fun. I went out with Billy Nichols, now working with The Who, my friend Richard Barnes, Barney, and
Right.
Speedy. We went down on my boat, Mafuta, I think it was called, on Old Grand Banks, down to all the way down the River Thames to the Isle of Sheppey and the near Southend. So, a good 30 miles, and then turned around and came back. And
Yeah.
um, I remember Speedy going up and down the stairs, and he'd done some time, and he said in the commercial navy, I think, because he kept coming upstairs and saying, "More cocoa, sir, more cocoa." And at one time, I let somebody else steer the boat, and I went downstairs, and he'd left the gas on, and um, as I switched it off, there was a spark, and it exploded. But
Oh.
luckily, the door had been open, so it hadn't built up. I could have killed them all. So, but we had some good times, and I saw a bit of him on and off occasionally, not very much. Jimmy, last time I saw him was that occasion
Mm.
at the Oscars in Hollywood, and very star-studded occasion. And he was like a superstar then. I think he was already in Wings,
Yeah.
um, or had been.
Right. Yeah. And then when you get to into the well, around 2002, I think it was, and then for about a decade after that, there was a like a reconstituted Thunderclap Newman with Andy, because Speedy and Jimmy had already passed away by then. And the final iteration of Thunderclap Newman was Andy and your nephew Josh and some others, and there was talk of them. There were some discussions, as far as I understand, of a new Thunderclap Newman album with your involvement.
That's right. We spoke about it. It wasn't looking particularly feasible, but it was something I was very interested in doing. I was very interested in working with Andy. Um, was it Ian Grant, the manager, who was trying to do it? But I remember Mark Brzezicki, the drummer, was involved in it as well.
Mhm.
And yeah, I can't. I was pretty positive about it as a possibility. But you know what they lacked was a songwriter.
Mm, right. Yeah, and then of course in the middle of it, Andy passed away in 2016. So that he was the final piece of the three, the three originals there. That
For me, it wasn't 2016. This was a much earlier than that. It was probably, around 2000, 2002, 2003, 2004, something like that.
okay,
I don't think it developed. I
yeah,
think Ian Grant and I talked about it and still do to some extent. Ian is involved in a big Parkinson's charity event at the moment, which is doing really, really well. But that's what we've been talking about. But when we spoke about Thunderclap, um, uh, it was always something to be built around, as far as I could remember it, Mark Brzezicki and Andy. I think that was the kicking off point.
yeah,
And he does write songs. He did write songs,
hmm
but they were very strange. They're very different kind of songs, and often didn't have lyrics. So they needed a poet or a lyricist to kind of. It could have been done. It would have been fun to do. It would
yeah,
have been quite an arty exercise. I don't
yeah,
think we would ever have got a number one record.
yeah. Yeah, I always listening to the one solo album that he did called Rainbow, that came out in '72. It's mostly instrumentals, and I just was wondering how would Trek have promoted this to the consumer or to the radio or anything like that, and it wasn't very commercially appealing. But yeah, so
Well,
definitely,
Rainbow, that was actually funded by me. Track didn't pay for it. I funded it. I helped Andy and Dick Seaman, who produced it. They made a studio in a van and took the van to church halls and to interesting acoustic spaces to record. It had two Revoxes in it, and they bounced from machine to machine. So it used the old Andy technique, the old
hmm
technique I've described, and I loved it. I thought it was really wonderful, and I think I mastered it and helped them mix it.
hmm
And I arranged for Graham Hughes, Roger's cousin, to do that glorious record cover where he
yeah.
took an upright piano onto a beach and just left it. Um, but I love it. But then I'm a huge fan of Andy's music. I
Yeah,
enjoyed it,
yeah,
but I don't think we expected it to do anything particularly. It was just something to honor Andy's technique, his eccentricity, and his style as a jazz performer. It's he's not a great virtuoso. He doesn't play scales. He doesn't do anything fancy. But melodically and harmonically and rhythmically, there's something very special. It always has been since the first moment I heard him. There's something very special
yeah,
about his technique.
yeah. So that's Thunderclap Newman. A very a one-off. The three guys were all very unique and fascinating in the album itself too. And just I don't know, when you think of Thunderclap Newman today, what is it that kind of stands out or sticks with you, um, today?
Well, there's one moment that I remember with the most amazing affection, which was that The Who did have Tommy released, and Something in the Air had a quite a long life in the charts in the UK. It stayed at #1 for a few weeks. And so around, I'd just come back, I think, from Live at Leeds. I'm not exactly sure of the chronology, but I was at Top of the Pops and they were on stage performing. And I remember this amazing feeling of being at Top of the Pops and not having to work.
Right.
And it felt fantastic. It felt like like being a back room boy, realizing that, because I've never been crazy about performing particularly, but I really like the studio work. So it was like an affirmation. Um, Probably what I should have done there is left the Who and become a record producer. I would have had a happier life.
Right. Well, it's an amazing story. It was a joy to research and to speak with, to speak with so many people that were there and part of the band and families and friends and things. And um, I hope that comes across in the book. And I really appreciate your input and the forward and all of your support for this. And thanks for taking the time today too.
Mark, the book is really, really good. It's really good. There are books about musicians. There's books about Tiny Tim, for example, and they're interesting. But the my friend Barney said the same thing. I don't know whether he wrote to you to say so, but when he read it, he wrote to me immediately and just said, it's just such an extraordinary story. This early, and we're talking there about the art school years when uh, Andy did that first concert, the magic of it, the extraordinary nature of it, his eccentricity, his friendship with Dick Seaman, who was an eccentric himself at Ealing. Um, Very, very strange man in many ways, but charming, charming, lovely, sweet guy. But uh, I think the book's, a classic in a sense. I think it really tells a story that needed to be told and does it with real humanity. I love it. I love, like I said, the Jimmy story is tragic, but you know,
Mhm.
Speedy's stories was not sad, I don't think. Andy's story is not sad, but
Mhm.
it is a story about, one hit wonders in a sense.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
story of ordinary people's lives, touched by the angels briefly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That means so much to me. I appreciate it. And thanks for the time today.
Yeah, I'm sorry I was late.
No, that's no problem at all. Thanks again, Pete.
Good to see you, Mark.
You too. Take care.